the chrome badge above the windscreen of the yellow school bus. One word stamped into the metal: Bedford. It was built at Pagewood in Sydney, one of the largest motor vehicle plants in the Southern Hemisphere. And here is the part nobody tells you. On that same factory floor, while Japanese aircraft were bombing Darwin, thousands of women built the wings of de Havilland Mosquito fighter bombers, the factory that armed Australia. For 2 decades, it became the school bus, the bread van, the fire truck. Bedford ran through the whole country. Then, on a Tuesday in 1972, General Motors killed it from a boardroom in Detroit, quietly, completely. And they did it decades before they ever touched Holden. The plant that built Mosquito wings and school buses is a Westfield car park now. How does a country lose the factory that armed it and not even notice? Before we go any further, hit like and subscribe. Every subscriber keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1. The Boy Sent to Save Vauxhall. Lawrence John Hartnett was born on the 26th of May, 1898, in Woking, Surrey, and his father was dead 7 months later. Here is the thing about the men who build industrial empires. They almost always start with a hole in them that the empire is supposed to fill. His mother carried the infant boy to live with her sister, and Lawrence grew up in other people's houses. He was sent to Epsom College, a school that existed to push boys into medicine, and he did not go into medicine. He went into engines. In 1915 he signed on as a management apprentice at Vickers. By 1918 he was learning to fly with the Royal Naval Air Service, and the war ended before he ever saw combat. He spent the rest of his life as a man who had arrived just after the decisive moment and could not stand the feeling. What he had instead was a salesman's instinct for anything with a motor in it. Buick in Singapore, General Motors in southern India, a sales desk in Sweden, and by January 1929, the export department of Vauxhall Motors in Luton, England, the British company General Motors, had bought 4 years earlier and could not work out how to fix. Hartnett's tool for fixing it was a truck. Bedford. The brand stood up on its own out of Luton around 1931, built deliberately plain, rugged, cheap, designed for the bad roads of the British Empire. Which meant Australia, South Africa, India, New Zealand. And here is what should have made him untouchable. He took an operation that was bleeding money and turned it into one of the only vehicle businesses on earth that grew through the Great Depression. But there was a contradiction inside the man, and it would build an empire and then break him. Lawrence Hartnett was a nationalist who worked for a global corporation. He believed an industry should have roots. General Motors believed in building things wherever the spreadsheet said, and the spreadsheet did not have a flag. That fight was coming. It would take 18 years to arrive, but not yet. In March 1934, General Motors put Lawrence Hartnett on a ship to Melbourne and told him to do for the Australian business what he had done at Luton. Fix it or shut it. Same man, same machine, the other side of the world. Chapter 2, 1931. The Great Depression broke the Australian motor industry like a dry stick over a knee. Holden's motor body builders of Woodville in Adelaide built 34,000 car bodies in the year 1930. The next year, 1931, they built 1,651. Read that again. 34,000 down to 1,651. In 12 months, a collapse of 95%. An entire skilled workforce, men who could shape steel and timber into the body of a car, the most advanced manufacturing skill the country had, standing in the Woodville yard with nothing in their hands. General Motors' own Australian arm was bleeding from the same wound. So in 1931, the same year Bedford was being stood up as its own brand on the other side of the planet, the two wounded companies were stitched together. General Motors Holdens Limited. Not a merger, born of ambition, a merger born of wreckage. Two half-drowned companies lashed together in the hope that together they might float. Sir Edward Holden became the first chairman. The Adelaide papers ran it as front-page news, and they were right to, because in South Australia, Holden's was not just a company. It was the thing a generation of tradesmen had built their lives around, and the Bedford truck arrived into this new company wearing two flags at once. The chassis, the engine, the frame, the gearbox came out of Vauxhall's plant at Luton in England. The body, the cab, the tray, the bus shell was built here. Australian hands, Australian plants. Marrickville, City Road, Woodville, Birkenhead, Newstead, Cottesloe. A period advertisement in the Melbourne Argus sold the Bedford as exactly that. British engineering underneath, Australian craftsmanship on top. For the bloke on the floor in Marrickville, that distinction was academic. The Bedford was the truck he built with his hands. The wage was the wage he carried home on a Thursday. The pride was real, and it was his. Here is what none of them could have known, standing in that Woodville yard at the bottom of the Depression. The company being assembled out of their misery, the one being built on the back of the worst year of their working lives, would, inside a single decade, build the largest motor vehicle plant in the entire Southern Hemisphere. And they would build it in a paddock, on the sandy edge of Sydney, in a suburb most of the country had never heard of. Chapter 3. 1,200 tonnes of steel. Stand on the corner of Heffron Road and Maroubra Bay Road, in the Sydney suburb of Pagewood, on the 1st of August, 1939. A few hundred people are standing in a paddock. The Premier of New South Wales, Bertram Stevens, leans down and lays a foundation stone into the sand. The plaque on it is bronze, and the words cast into that bronze read, and you have to read this twice to feel the full weight of it, that from the foundation of New South Wales in 1788, this land was unoccupied until it was purchased by General Motors Holden's as the site for these works. Unoccupied, the land of the Bidjigal people, country that had been lived on, hunted, walked and held for tens of thousands of years before a single brick was laid, described in cast bronze as empty. 1939, Australia did not think twice about that word, but there it is, in metal, in the historical record. Hold on to that plaque. We are coming back to it, and it is going to mean something very different by the time we do. Then the factory went up at a speed that would be flat out illegal under modern construction law. 1,200 tonnes of structural steel, 283,000 square feet of concrete foundation, 23 weeks, 23 from bare paddock to a finished roof. Trial production started in January 1940. On the 15th of February, Prime Minister Robert Menzies opened the plant officially, riding through the new building in the back of a Vauxhall Tourer, with a body built, of course, in Adelaide. 3 shifts, around 1,250 workers in that first year. A canteen, a sports ground out the back. It was not just a factory, it was a small society with a roof on it. And among the men who walked in through the Pagewood gates in those early years was a young bloke named Neil Pogson, who took a job on the industrial engineering team. Remember that name, because Pogson is going to be our thread all the way through this story. His job, for his entire working life, was to time that factory's heartbeat, to measure it station by station and squeeze the wasted seconds out. He knew that plant the way you know a person. He would, decades later, write its history himself, and he gave it a title that tells you exactly how it ended. He called it The Rise and Demise of Pagewood. On the day he started, Pogson believed completely that he would retire out of that same building. Hold on to him, the way you are holding on to the plaque, because 18 months after Menzies cut that ribbon, Japanese aircraft came out of the sky over Pearl Harbor. And the factory, built to make sedans for suburban Sydney, was about to become something nobody had drawn on the plans. Chapter 4. The Wing Shop. Go back to the 7th of December, 1941. Pearl Harbor. And then 12 weeks later, on the 19th of February, 1942, Japanese aircraft came over Darwin. The official toll of that raid is 235 dead. Australia, on the morning of that raid, had almost no capacity to build a modern combat aircraft. Think about how exposed that is. A whole continent suddenly inside the range of an enemy air force and barely able to manufacture the machines it would need to defend itself. What Australia had was factories. Factories like Pagewood. And so the plant that had been laid out to assemble sedans for suburban Sydney was handed over to de Havilland Aircraft. And the building became a wing shop for the de Havilland Mosquito, the plywood fighter bomber, the aircraft they called the Wooden Wonder, one of the fastest things in the sky. The Holden Retirees Club archive holds a set of photographs donated by a man named David Francis of exactly what went on inside that building. Women in canvas aprons. The dope shop, where doped linen was stretched and sealed taut over the wooden wing ribs, a smell that got into your clothes and stayed there. Camouflage paint going on by hand in long, careful strokes. And then the finished wings being trucked out of Pagewood across the city to Bankstown for final assembly onto the fuselages. But here is the part the proud brochures leave out. Here is the cost bolted to the triumph. There were quality control failures in that wing production, wings that were not built true, and mosquitoes came apart in the air because of it. Australian aircrew died because the wings coming out of the wing shop were not always right. Production had to be stopped while the fault was hunted down and fixed. That is the real history. The triumph and the catastrophe on the same factory floor, made by the same hands. Australia built 104 Mosquitoes during the war, 212 in total by the time the program finally wound up in 1948. And down in Adelaide, the Woodville plant was doing the same kind of work, turning out components for the Beaufort bomber, part of a national aircraft effort that built hundreds of Beauforts and Beaufighters and Boomerangs and Wirraways and close to 2,000 aircraft engines, from almost nothing, in a few years. And Lawrence Harton Getoy ran the wider machine, Director of Ordnance Production, a seat on the board of the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, Chairman of the Army Inventions Directorate. The man who had been shipped out to sell trucks was now sitting near the dead centre of the entire Australian war production effort, and by his own account, he found the pace of it exhilarating. He ran all of it, and in December 1946, with the war won and the country safe, General Motors got rid of him. Chapter 5. Too Australian. Why would a corporation fire the man who built its Australian empire, the man who ran its war production? Because Lawrence Hartnett wanted something General Motors did not want him to have. He wanted a car designed in Australia, designed by Australians, for Australian roads, Australian distances, Australian heat. Detroit's position was simpler and colder, and Australia should take an existing American design and build it quietly and gratefully, without getting ideas. Hartnett's local team drew up their own Australian design without authorisation from head office, and when it landed in front of the Americans, the record says the words were crazy and a waste of time. Hartnett took the Mavericks Road anyway. He went over heads. He lobbied the Australian government to lean on General Motors from the outside. And in December 1946, his run ran out. His successor, a man named Harold Bettel, said the quiet part out loud, and for the record said that the old regime, the one under which there had been insufficient consideration given to company policy, was over. Sit with that phrase, insufficient consideration given to company policy. Translate it into plain English. He cared too much about the wrong country. That was the offence. That was the entire charge sheet. And here is the bitter joke of it. The car Hartnett had fought for, bled for, risked his career for, became the 48-215, the first Holden. The car that is still, to this day, a sacred object in the Australian story. When it was finally unveiled in November 1948, with Prime Minister Ben Chifley standing at the front, Lawrence Hartnett was not there. He had been pushed out before the thing he built rolled into the daylight. He tried to do it on his own. He started the Hartnett Motor Company, his own Australian car, a genuine all-or-nothing roll of the dice by a man in his 50s who could not let the idea go. And it failed. Undercapitalised, starved of materials, somewhere between 70 and 125 cars ever actually completed. The historical record disagrees on the exact number, but not on the ending. General Motors, for what it is worth, had offered him a senior post back in America. He turned it down flat. He stayed in the country that had just sacked him, because it was his country in a way the corporation would never understand. But here is what you need to hold on to. The brand he had carried halfway around the world, from Luton to Sydney, Bedford, was still everywhere, still on the school run, still on the bread round, still on the fire front, carnation red, throwing water at a wall of flame. Bedford did not need Hartnett any more. Bedford was woven into the country now, until a Tuesday in 1972. Chapter 6. The Yellow School Bus. Stay with the country for a minute before we go back to the boardroom, because you cannot understand what was taken until you understand how deep it went. Here is the thing about Bedford in Australia that is genuinely hard to get your head around. Almost every single Australian alive between 1946 and 1976 touched one. Not as a brand on a billboard, physically touched one. You rode in one to school. You took a delivery off the back of one. You fought a fire from the tray of one. Start with the Bedford OB 932 of them assembled in Australia between 1947 and 1952. Greyhound ran them. Country bus services ran them hard, for decades, down dirt roads that would shake a lesser machine to pieces. Then the Bedford SB, the yellow school bus. And here is a detail that should genuinely stop you where you stand. The bodies of those school buses were built by the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, the same firm, the same Fisherman's Bend workforce, that had built Wirraway trainers and boomerang fighter planes during the Second World War. The men who had bolted together warplanes to defend this country were now, in peacetime, bolting together the bus shell that carried the kid to school. The fighter plane factory built the school bus. The Bedford R-Series went to the Country Fire Authority of Victoria, painted carnation red, fitted with British-built Godiva pumps that could throw 2,250 litres of water a minute at a fire front. The Bedford CF van became the bread van, the milk van, the plumber's van, and here Australian engineers did something Luton never did. They pulled out the British 4-cylinder engine, which nobody on this continent trusted, and dropped a Holden inline 6 into the bay instead. An Australian fix for a British problem. The most reliable Bedford van in the world. And it was reliable because Australians made it that way. Neil Pogson was right there through the golden age, on the industrial engineering team, timing the van line at Pagewood, station by station, the way he timed everything. The car park was packed every morning. The canteen was loud every lunchtime. This was the peak. Bedford stitched right through the spine of Australian life. The school run, the bread round, the bushfire front. A British chassis, an Australian body, an Australian workforce, and an Australian engineering culture that made the thing better than it had any right to be. Now hold that picture. The full car park, the loud canteen, the yellow bus on a dirt road, and go to Detroit. Chapter 7. the phone call from Detroit. In 1971, General Motors bought a stake in a Japanese vehicle manufacturer called Isuzu, a corporate decision made in Detroit. For Detroit's reasons, a way to get into the small, efficient end of the truck market without spending Detroit's money designing anything. The very next year, 1972, that decision arrived in Australia wearing a strange and revealing badge. General Motors Holdens started selling Isuzu trucks here, but not as Isuzu. Australians did not know Isuzu, so they sold them as, and you need to hear this phrase properly, Bedford by Isuzu. And this is where it gets genuinely insane, because we have seen this exact move before. We saw it at the very start of this story. Back in 1929, when General Motors wanted to launch the Bedford name in Britain, it did not launch it cold. It leaned the new, unknown name up against an established one. It called the trucks Chevrolet Bedford, borrowed Chevrolet's trust, used it as a bridge, walked the new brand across, and then, once Bedford could stand on its own, it quietly dropped the Chevrolet. Now look at what they did in 1972. 43 years later, the same corporation ran the identical play, except this time, Bedford was the bridge. Bedford was the trusted old name being leaned on. Borrow Bedford's trust, the trust that Australian workers and Australian drivers had spent 40 years building. Walk Isuzu across it, and then, once Isuzu could stand on its own, drop Bedford. By the back half of the 1970s, the Bedford name was fading off the trucks altogether. They were just Isuzu. Local truck assembly shifted across to the Holden plant at Dandenong. So understand precisely what happened here. The brand was not killed in a single, dramatic stroke. There was no announcement, no funeral, no front page. It was transferred. Handed quietly from a British General Motors subsidiary to a Japanese one, like an inheritance passing between two branches of a family, and the country in the middle. The country that had actually built Bedford into something that meant something. The bodybuilders, the assembly lines, the CFA volunteers, the kids on the yellow buses, was never once asked, never in the room, never even properly told. And I want to be precise about who did this, because it matters. This was not a decision made by Vauxhall in England. It was not a decision made by the Holden men in Melbourne. They were the ones who had to carry it out. But they did not author it. This was decided 9,000 miles away in Detroit by people for whom the Australian Bedford was a single line on a very large spreadsheet, people who had never seen an Australian school bus and never would. Up in Brisbane, the General Motors Holdens plant at Acacia Ridge was humming along. Trucks and Holdens rolling off the line. Around 1,500 people on the floor, a whole community's worth of mortgages and school fees and Friday nights at the club. Acacia Ridge had absolutely no idea it was next. Chapter 8. The Cracks. By the end of the 1970s, the cracks in the Australian operation were showing everywhere you cared to look, if you were willing to look. The smaller assembly plants were already gone or quietly going. The General Motors footprint in Perth. The old plant at Birkenhead in Adelaide, where the last vehicle off the line had, fittingly, been a Pontiac. One by one, the lights in the regional plants were going out, and each one was a town's worth of work. Then, in 1979, the Industries Assistance Commission handed down a report on the passenger motor vehicle industry, and anyone who read it carefully could see exactly where the wind was about to blow. Tariff protection, the wall that had stood around Australian manufacturing for half a century, was not going to stand forever. The word starting to be used in Canberra and in the press was rationalisation. And rationalisation is one of those words that sounds like sense and lands like a redundancy notice. And then the second oil shock hit in 1979, and the whole market lurched hard towards smaller, lighter, more efficient cars almost overnight. Here was Pagewood's specific, fatal problem. When General Motors Holdens brought out its answer to that new market, the VB Commodore, it built the thing at Elizabeth in South Australia, not at Pagewood. And so Pagewood, the largest vehicle plant in the Southern Hemisphere, the plant that built the Mosquito wings, the plant Robert Menzies himself had opened, the plant where Neil Pogson had spent his entire adult life, Pagewood, was being left year by year with less and less to actually do. A factory is a living thing. It needs product the way a body needs blood. And Pagewood was slowly being bled. And here is the cruelest detail of the whole chapter. Neil Pogson and his industrial engineering team had spent their entire careers timing that plant for maximum output, finding the wasted seconds, squeezing them out, making it faster, making it more. Now the job quietly turned inside out. Now they were timing the wind down. Measuring the plant, not for how much it could produce, but for how little it could be reduced to. The same skill, the same men, the same stopwatches. Pointed in reverse. Pogson wrote about this later, and what he wrote is one of the most haunting things in this whole story. He wrote that the worst part was not the announcement when it finally came. The worst part was the long stretch before it, the months when the men on the floor could feel the place changing underneath them, and the men in the office knew exactly why, and nobody was allowed to say it out loud. A whole factory full of people, all of them feeling it coming, none of them permitted to name it, and then, in 1980, somebody named it. Chapter 9. The Last Shift. Here is how the workers at Pagewood found out that their factory, their working lives, their mortgages, the thing their families had been built around, was closing. They heard it on the radio. Not from management, not in a meeting called on the factory floor. The announcement simply went out, and blokes who had given that plant 20, 30, in some cases 40 years of their lives, heard the news of their own ending on a Sydney radio station, in the canteen at Smoko, or in the car on the drive home, the way you would hear a football score. Around 1,500 jobs, heard second-hand, over the airwaves, from strangers. And think hard about who those workers actually were. Pagewood, like every great Australian industrial plant of that era, had been built by migration. Italian families, Greek families, Maltese, Yugoslav, Polish families, people who had crossed the entire world after the Second World War with a suitcase and not much else, and who had built their whole Australian lives inside that perimeter fence. The wage came from Pagewood. The mortgage on the little brick place in Maroubra, or Matraville, was serviced by Pagewood. The kids were raised on Pagewood. You did not just work there, you were from there. There is a photograph in the Holden Retirees Club archive of the Industrial Engineering Department near the very end. They staged what they themselves called a ball and chain party. The men whose entire professional purpose was efficiency, the men with the stopwatches, posing for the camera with mock balls and chains around their ankles. That is gallows humour. That is what people do with a feeling when there is nothing left to do with it. And here is the detail that sits strangest of all, the one that tells you exactly how little warning these people were given. About 12 months before the end came into clear view, Pagewood had hosted the Vice Premier of China, Madame Chen, walked her through the floor as an honoured international guest, the plant on display as a showpiece of Australian industry. A showpiece one year, a memory the next. Formal closure came in 1982, and at some point in the winding down, somebody went and prized the bronze foundation plaque off the wall, the unoccupied plaque, the one Premier Stevens had laid in 1939. It did not go to a museum. It went into a private collection where it sits to this day, a documentary record of the beginning of Pagewood, removed and pocketed at the end of Pagewood. The largest vehicle plant in the Southern Hemisphere, 1,200 tonnes of steel. gone quiet. And 5 years later, on that exact same corner of Heffron Road, something else opened its doors. Something with a ribbon and a governor and champagne. Chapter 10, October 1987. But before that corner in Sydney, go north for a moment. Go to Brisbane, the General Motors Holden's plant at Acacia Ridge, the one that had no idea it was next, built its last vehicle at the end of October 1984. Around 1,000 jobs gone. And the company marked the occasion by putting out a special commemorative issue of its in-house magazine, a glossy farewell publication, for a factory for 1,000 people's livelihoods. There is a very particular kind of corporate coldness in a printed goodbye. There is a genuine argument to be had about the closures of this whole era. Pagewood, Acacia Ridge, Birkenhead, all of it. Some people will tell you it was simply inevitable. The unavoidable price of a small country joining a genuinely global economy. The tariff wall always going to come down eventually. The maths always going to win. Other people will tell you it was nothing of the kind, that it was a series of specific choices, made by specific people in specific rooms, and that those choices could have been made differently. The honest answer is that the historical record holds both of those readings. And this video is not going to insult you by pretending it can settle an argument that economists still have not. But here is what is not in dispute. Here is what physically, literally, happened on that corner of Heffron Road and Bunurong Road in Pagewood. 5 years after the Holden plant closed, on the 19th of October 1987, Westfield East Gardens opened on the site, a $200 million shopping centre, for a while the largest in the entire country. 1,300 invited guests, the Governor of New South Wales, Sir James Rowland, Frank Lowy of Westfield, the man himself, a ribbon, trays of champagne moving through the crowd, and here is the timing. Exact and absolutely pitiless. The 19th of October 1987 is Black Monday. It is the single most catastrophic day in the modern history of the world's stock markets. Wall Street collapsing more than 20%. The crash rolling around the planet, hitting Australia within hours. So picture the scene properly. Picture champagne glasses being raised on a corner in suburban Sydney, raised on the exact concrete where the Mosquito wing shop once stood, where women in canvas aprons had stretched linens over the wings of fighter aircraft to defend this country, and picture the world's financial markets collapsing in real time, that very day, outside the doors. The factory that armed Australia in 1942. Paved into a car park, opened as a shopping centre, on Black Monday. You could not write it. If you put it in a film script, they would tell you it was too much, too neat, too cruel. But it happened. It is on the record. And the man who started all of it, the boy from Woking, the man sent to save Vauxhall, he was not there to see it. He was already gone. Chapter 11. What 1,200 tons of steel built. Stand on the corner of Heffron Road and Bunurong Road today. It is a Westfield. The car park stretches out across the ground where the largest motor vehicle plant in the Southern Hemisphere once stood. Somewhere beneath the polished retail floor, beneath the food court, is the spot where the wing shop was, where the Mosquitos were born, where the doped linen was stretched over the wing ribs. There is no statue. There is no plaque on public display. The bronze one was prized off and pocketed decades ago, and the building it was bolted to is climate-controlled shopping now. You could walk that centre once a week for your entire life and never know a single thing about what the ground beneath you used to be. Lesson 1. Sovereignty has a workshop. The factory that built Mosquito wings when this country was actually under air attack, when Darwin had been bombed and the war was at the door, was the same factory General Motors hollowed out and walked away from in peacetime. And here is what that has to teach you, and it is not a soft lesson. The capacity to build things is not a switch on a wall that you flick back on whenever you finally decide you need it. It is skill held in the hands of specific, particular people inside a specific building. And when you close the building and scatter the people, that capacity does not sit patiently in a cupboard waiting for you to want it again. It is gone. The people get old. The building becomes a shopping centre. Australia learned, in the panic of 1942, that it desperately needed factories like Pagewood, and Australia let itself forget that lesson again by 1982. You do not get to industrialise a country twice on the same afternoon. Lesson 2. The brand was Australian. The country was the cost. Bedford by Isuzu is a phrase that should be carved on a headstone somewhere in Pagewood, because it is the entire story compressed into 3 words. A trusted name, used as a bridge, walked across and then abandoned on the far side once it had served its purpose. The decision was made in Detroit. The Holden men in Melbourne carried it out because carrying it out was their job. And the people who had actually built Bedford into something an Australian would trust, with his kids and his crops and his life. The bodybuilders, the assembly lines, the CFA volunteer behind the wheel of the carnation red tanker, the kid on the vinyl seat of the yellow bus. Not one of them was ever in the room. Not one of them was ever going to be. And understand this clearly, because it is the part people get wrong. Foreign capital is not a villain twirling a moustache. It is simpler and colder than that. It does not hate you. It does not think about you at all. And a country that allows every decision about its own industry to be made entirely somewhere else has quietly agreed in advance to be the line item, the thing the spreadsheet adjusts. Lesson 3. They did it to Bedford first. Everybody remembers Holden, October 2017, the last car down the line at Elizabeth. A nation watching the news that night. The grief of it genuine and shared. And that grief was right. But it was not the first time, it was the second time. General Motors had run this exact play 45 years earlier, on a truck and bus empire just as Australian, just as woven into the country. And it ran that play so quietly that the country did not even register the loss. That is the thing that should keep you up. Not that it happened. That it happened invisibly. Lawrence Hartnett saw it coming in 1946, saw that a corporation with no flag would always in the end decide against the country, and he was sacked for the crime of caring. He died in 1986, the year the Bedford plant in England was shut down too. He outlived his own empire by a matter of months. Stand in the Westfield food court, on the corner of Heffron and Bunnerong. Somewhere under your feet is the wing shop floor, the spot where thousands of Australian women built the wings that defended this country in its most frightened year. There is no plaque, there is no line on a wall, there is the chrome badge of a brand the country forgot it ever built, and one word stamped into the metal, and nobody left who looks up to read it. How does a country lose the factory that armed it and not even notice? It hands the keys to someone who is never going to look up either.